Alright, everybody, for today's video, we are going to be discussing sex in video games with all the cringiness and awkwardness of the PE teacher sex talk back in high school. And before we begin, this is going to be entirely G-rated and safe for work. There will be no sexy images or anything like that other than what you see right here. And I probably just set a meme storm off in the Game Wisdom Discord channel. When it comes to Western civilization, sex is kind of the last bastion of conservatism when it comes to media and pop culture. We've dealt with music corrupting our youth, tabletop games being the devil, I think, video games ruining society, and even violence has since been met with acceptance. Imagine showing something like Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead 30 or 40 years ago. But yet, sex remains kind of still a taboo topic among mainstream media, and the same is certainly true when it comes to the video game side of things. And despite how forward-thinking game developers and the industry has been, it's still very much considered this taboo topic. But a certain Kickstarter for a game that we'll be talking a little bit more about in the second half of this video kind of lit this conversation about whether or not this is the right time to talk about adult or sex games when it comes to the game industry. Now, with that said, of course, there have been games that have used sex or sexual situations for a very long time. Some of them have had a chance at breaking the mainstream, but the vast majority of them have been either on the independent side or on very weird sites and such out there. But when it comes to the game industry, at least from the mainstream side, there's essentially the spectrum of sex-based games. On one hand, you have games that are more about gameplay. The other side, you have just pure sex and the voyeuristic side of things. So let's start over here. Pretty much, the basic idea is to have a game that uses sex as either a secondary reward or a kind of a part of the experience, but you're still playing a game. You're still doing the gameplay or the core gameplay loop, and the sex is just kind of there. Some examples would be stuff like the original or the first set of Leisure Suit Larry games, Conker's BFD, even something along the lines of like BMX XXX. And of course, the many games that use strip clubs as popular venues for action and first and third person shooters during the last decade. In this regard, the sex is kind of there to spice things up. It's, that check mark on the box to say, hey, we're adult and edgy and stuff like that. And we could even use stuff like the Grand Theft Auto series in some extent in this example. Now, moving a little bit further to more of the sex side of things, we can look at games that went more towards the sex being the main attraction, but there were still some game elements to it. And this definitely falls in a lot of the independent side of games that will feature highly sexualized characters, and they're again there to sell the experience, but there's still gameplay that goes with it. So we can look at stuff like some of the earlier Mortal Kombat games, Dead or Alive, and again, pick any indie game that's a platformer or some kind of action-based game, but there's still, a highly sexualized element to it. And then as we get into kind of like the middle, this is when we start to see more of an exploration of sex, but with video games or video game gameplay. That was not easy to say. And probably the high mark for this example would be the very best visual novel games. These are titles that tell a story or allow the player to control or manipulate a story, but deal with issues of sex and sexuality. This is where we saw the vast majority of games that are aimed at kind of exploring LGBTQ characters, even stuff like BDSM, and again, other things that I can't mention without getting the channel too many flags on it. I think there's this game, what was it, A Lady Killer in a Bind. Now, I think it was done by Christina Love, or I forget her name. That's probably like the most representative of this example. But the point is, with this category, that there's definitely meant to explore this idea of sex and sexuality, but you're still having a game to it. And many of these titles will deal with more of these serious repercussions. And there are a lot of examples, I'm sure, on Steam, Itch, and the like. And like I said, this is where a lot of people see things as kind of the watermark, or the high mark for this kind of discussion. With that said, though, now we get into things go downhill, as we start to look at games that push these sexualized aspects and don't really do anything with gameplay. The gameplay is either second or even like fourth or fifth down the list in terms of why you're playing these games. They are very basic to the point of even non-existent. If there is any gameplay, it really wasn't given much thought or development time compared to focusing on the 3D models. And we can even look at some of the lesser visual novel games that have very little gameplay or choice, and it's just about pure adulterated content. Again, I can't give you any examples. But this is the kind of stuff, as we even get further and further down, that has really come to populate Steam, itch.io, and so on. And this is the stuff that if you watch our Sunday show, when we do our live segment, like, there are games I have to cut the footage just to see first and make sure that this is actually something we can show. Because it gets very graphic. And if you haven't gone down that rabbit hole, good on you for that one. You've dodged a bullet that unfortunately I've been hit with many times. But when we get to the far extreme, we're not even talking about video games anymore. It's just essentially digitalized pornography. And many of these games will just be you be able to manipulate anatomically incorrect 3D models. Many of them will even feature the ever-popular nude patch as their way of circumventing Steam's policy on adult games, because the game itself is, M-rated or PG-13, but we just so happen to have this patch that turns it AO. It's not required, but, it's just there for people to play. And when we talk about sex and video game side of things, it gets to the point of, that is the side of things that people will always assume, that it is just childish, immature, and, it's just meant to be exploitive. But there are a few points here. The first one is that we have seen a few developers try to embrace more of the maturity of sex, and sorry about rubbing my nose so much, it is allergy season here. But Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and BioWare have been trying to do more with pushing relationships, romance, and things like that, and they got into trouble with kind of the conservative media back during the initial release. Of course, that stuff is kind of like USA at night in terms of what the other content that we've seen. But the other point is that for the vast majority of people, there is a market for these kinds of games. If there wasn't a market for sex, the pornography industry would have disappeared overnight. But we're going to take a quick Patreon shout out and sponsor break in a second here. But when we return, we're going to talk about kind of the game that led to this discussion, and more importantly, is there a happy medium between gameplay and sexualized content? But first, here's that shout out. And now a quick thank you to our Patreon backers, as well as to the current Game Wisdom sponsors. And if you'd like to continue the discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. Yep, we're back to me. Because there is no video game that I've played that will probably go best with this topic, and the footage that I could get will lead to some more possible flagging of this channel. So unfortunately, again, you're still stuck with me. But the game that kind of led to it, and I'm not going to name it, again, to try and keep out of some of the trouble, but if you followed any major game site over the last week, you probably know what it is. This comes from a studio that is known for making very adult and hardcore animations. And they decide to basically take their knowledge of Unreal and try and make a video game. And what they're trying to do is, as we've said in the last part, make an elevated take on a sex game. And the Kickstarter has basically earned all the stretch goals that they could ever imagine for it, and unless something really horrible happens in the 11th hour, they're probably going to get the funding and make this game. Whether or not it's good or bad remains to be seen. But this leads into this very interesting topic about, can there be an elevated take on sex games? And I know a few of you watching this right now are probably snickering to yourself, but it is a legitimate question. Because if the video game industry can elevate violence and killing, surely it could do the same thing with sex, right? And I know one of my followers, I think they mentioned about they would like to try and make an elevated take on the visual novel genre. I'm not going to name them, but I'm sure they'll leave a comment down below if they want to. But like we said, there is a market demand for this kind of stuff. But there are a few concerns here. So getting back to the Kickstarter game, I looked over the page, I looked at what their stretch goals were, what they were describing, and a few things kind of stood out in a bad way. They're describing the game as being a, adult game mixed with a shmup, mixed with a tactical strategy XCOM-like. And they've said that they are not game developers. And XCOM-like is similar to something like Dwarf Fortress, where you don't just on a whim decide to make that game. That's something you need to study and understand in depth in order to make it actually work. And from what it sounds like I don't know if they have the skill or not to pull that off. I may be surprised, but again, it's kind of like saying that because I watch how somebody builds a car on TV, I can build my own car from scratch. The other point is that it looks very much, again, like the majority of the goals and everything are built on the adult side of things, while they're still trying to turn this into like a 30-40 hour long campaign. And this takes me to this kind of issue when we talk about this. The first point is, can you actually combine these two elements together? Can you make a game, what does a highly elevated gameplay focus, but still adult game look like? And don't say, hot coffee from Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas, because that was more, again, of like a side feature or something just there to check a box off. But again, we really haven't seen anyone try and push both the hardcore adult side of things while still being a legitimate game angle. And again, that's kind of what led to developers doing this Kickstarter in the first place. But the second point is, would someone, or is that market willing to kind of work for this content? Again, when we talk about the adult games that we see on Steam and itch, it is all laid bare. You basically turn the game on, and you have everything right then and there. There's no real game to it. But would people be wanting to play an actual game and have that as a reward? I know there's that whole discussion on that game, Hoonie Pop, and that still, to me, looked very much like being more, sex first, gameplay third or fourth down the line. But this is a topic that I am certainly not versed in. So, for the people watching this, would you do that? Would you play a game for 20, 30, 40 hours and have that content be either locked or as a reward for learning the game systems, as opposed to just getting one of the many, and I do mean many games that just give it to you immediately? Again, I can't sit here and begin to, answer that one myself. But getting back to the Kickstarter and to this topic at hand, that it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see where things go and whether or not they will go. Like I've said, we've seen many games tackle sexuality from the independent side, but it's still very much considered taboo among AAA. And whether or not we'll see that game remains to be seen. But the amount of notoriety and attention this Kickstarter is getting has certainly, I think, opened up the door for these kinds of discussions. And whether or not we'll, kick this last taboo remains to be seen. Now, because of the nature of this topic, I do want to request that if you, for the comments down below, please don't leave any comments to game examples or to sites or anything like that. Again, this is meant to be kind of like a G or I guess maybe a Y7 discussion about this topic. So, if there are any, I will try and block them if I can catch them. But with that said, to wrap things up for today, sex in video games is still considered like the instant qualifier for adults only, or non-rated if we talk about the independent space. But while these games have existed in many ways, shapes, and forms, underground and on the internet, it has been something that disappeared from the AAA or commercial side of things. Again, one of the simplest reasons is that no retail store is going to stock an AO game. And for the longest time, the AO rating from the ASRB is basically just kill a game immediately. But with the rise of the internet and with, the unrated nature of it, it has left things open for people to make these games. However, again, the spectrum ranges from either games that either use sex as just a simple ploy, or on the other hand, just being completely graphic to the point that it's never going to fly on any store, essentially. Like, you would never be able to do that. And it still remains to be seen whether or not we can have a game, a legitimate game, from start to finish in terms of a core gameplay loop, it's all refined well, but still be adults only. And what will happen, or if that does happen, will it allow for more adults only games? And more importantly, how will people respond to that? Will they use this as an excuse just to try and take that more extreme side and bring over to mainstream games? Or will there be an attempt to try and, again, have that legitimate game in the same way that we see how hardcore violence has kind of been approached and changed in recent years? I mean, if you can have stuff like God of War, Mortal Kombat 11, or any other extreme violent game, why not have a game that deals with sex? I guess that's my final question for our video. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. If you're looking for a book on design, my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, is out now. It is available where most books are sold, and it comes in paper, hardcover, or digital copies. This is the perfect book for anyone interested in learning about game design, whether you are a student, enthusiast, or just a fan. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.